and welcome to episode 10 of React Native Radio. Today on our show, we have Jed Watson.
Hey, everyone.
Kevin Old.
Hey, everyone.
And our special guest today is Andy Street.
Hey there.
Andy, before we get started on our topic, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of give us a quick background about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I work at Facebook on React Native in London. I work on the Android side of it. Before I was working on React Native, I started at Facebook actually as a web engineer. So I worked on the pages and timeline products. And actually before that, I was working at Microsoft on the Windows kernel as an intern, moved to web programming. And then in 2012, we had this major shift at Facebook where we were focusing on, actually making native versions of our apps. Because for the iOS and Android domain apps, a lot of it was written using web views, and it wasn't really given a great experience. It was taking forever to load. It didn't really feel like the platforms. So we kind of moved a lot of our web engineers over to doing mobile work, and I moved to Android and did that for a couple of years working on pages and search. And then I guess about a year and a half ago, a little bit less than a year and a half ago, they were looking at starting up the React Native Android team. They were looking for someone to come to London to go work on it. And so I went and did that. And on the React Native Android team, I guess I'm the tech lead on that team. I was one of the first people on the team. And the major areas that I work on are like the bridge, which is kind of similar to what Tadeu works on, except on the Android side, and UI performance.
Okay, so you kind of got into Android after being in web.
Yeah, well, I had done a little bit of Android, in school, just kind of messing around with it. I didn't really release any popular apps, but I knew a little bit about, what I was doing. But then I definitely actually learned how to program well in Android, after I had done web. Yeah.
How was the transition going from, well, I know you said that you already kind of knew what you were doing, but kind of going from a full-time web day-to-day to a full-time Android, how was that, just out of curiosity, for other web developers that may be listening?
Web development and web development at Facebook is a little bit different, and so is Android development and Android development at Facebook. Our app at the time that I started working on Android was when we tried to build it like you would normally build in open source. I think it was if you just had a standard Android app using IntelliJ, it was taking something like 15 minutes for a incremental build. I think we were using Gradle at that time. And so it was a huge change from coming from web, where it's kind of you try something and if you don't know what you're doing, then, you just keep trying stuff and refreshing, and there's not really too much of a cost there. And for Android, it was being a beginner and trying to learn something like positioning elements or something with some new layout that you hadn't used before was absolutely awful. So it was that transition involved a lot of kind of sitting there and twiddling my thumbs. And fortunately, it meant that I met up with a lot of the more senior Android developers at the company, just because it's you need help from other people that know what they're doing. Otherwise, you just I was going to waste so much time trying to figure out what I was doing by myself. Yeah, that was basically what it was like. It was pretty hellish.
So did you get into software development? Is it something you studied in school, or is it something that you kind of just got into?
I had gotten into it, I guess, when I was in middle or high school. It was actually, I started programming on the TI-83. I don't know if any of y'all used that back in school, but it was I remember the first thing that I programmed was this little thing where you can move an O around the screen using the cursor. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. But for a while, I thought I was actually going to do biology. And then something with computer science. I took a computer science course in high school and did really well at it and really liked it. So I ended up studying computer science and math in university.
I remember Snake on the TI-83. That's what I remember.
Yeah, it was a lot like that, actually. There's something so satisfying about that first time that you get a computer to do what you tell it to do. Really satisfying.
Well, our topic today is going to be focused basically on developing in React Native and specifically with Android, but we're also going to kind of go into some of the, I guess, behind the scenes, or how Android was implemented and kind of what you guys went through getting that to work. So I guess we'll start with a question. So when you guys started developing React Native, was Android on the, I guess it was kind of something that you guys had in mind, but you guys went ahead and did iOS first, and kind of how did that whole discussion go?
So when we were first implementing React Native, I wasn't part of the team at that point, but that was like, I guess, Jordan and Christopher and Ashwin. They knew that it was going to go to, sorry, that's Christopher Shadow and Jordan Walk. They knew it was going to go to Android at some point, but it's like, if you're going to iterate and try to figure out what the right APIs are for this, like doing it just on one platform makes so much more sense than trying to implement it on the second platform and iterate on that platform at the same time. So they were kind of looking for APIs that they knew would work on both platforms, but kind of doing the bare minimum of research there. So it was like, they knew it was going to happen, but that definitely was not a focus.
How has it been working that into the same code base? So Android coming into the same, what appears to be React Native code base.
So the APIs that they made are actually were really good. Trying to think of some examples. Some of the cool ones, I really like that we were able to reuse the CSS layout stuff that Christopher wrote. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but that was the JavaScript implementation of like a minimal Flexbox API. And he had transpiled it to C. And I mean, transpile is kind of a nice word for it because it was just like a series of regexes. So I was like, oh man, that seems awesome. I'll just create my own series of regexes to turn it into Java code. And we're able to just use the same logic for that on Android as well. I guess the biggest pain point was that at the same time we're trying to implement React Native for Android, React Native for iOS is also, moving to try to open source and doing their own changes and stuff. And at this point we are sharing JavaScript code. So one of the first things that we did was pretty much everything that we wrote for Android had some sort of instrumentation test for it. So just making sure that it worked. And then all of those instrumentation tests would run whenever the iOS people committed their JavaScript code and would block them from landing stuff that broke Android. And if we hadn't had that, then I think we would have spent way longer developing the Android part.
Did you feel like you had all eyes on you while you were building Android? I mean, everyone's super keen to get their hands on that first build.
Yeah, I was the amount of excitement in the community was a big motivating factor for me personally. I think for the rest of the team, whereas everyone was so excited to see it that it just made you want to keep working on it all the time. But I don't think it made me nervous or anything, if that's what you're asking. It was just kind of we were excited about it. Everyone else is excited about let's do this.
Yeah, there was a timer, a countdown timer someone had set up for the release based on some comment someone had made or something like that.
Yeah, that was, I think Christopher had tweeted about it or something, given some time. And it was
Chris said, give us 6 months, and everyone took that to heart.
Right.
Basically.
Yeah. It was there's a thread somewhere internally on Facebook where Christopher is we need to give people a date. I think one of us said 3 months. I was nah, you should probably double that. So then Christopher said 6 months. I think he thought that was going to be more than we needed, but we, I guess, hit it exactly, which seemed good.
So what's your perception of how it's been received in the community? Are people using it and actually solving the whole problem with cross-platform development? So are they actually using React Native Android and React Native for iOS in the way that you guys intended?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely are. So the types of apps that I think React Native is best suited for right now is the kinds of apps that we're seeing there. I've been very impressed with the apps that people have been putting out, and also the contributions back that teams have been doing for if they don't have support for something that they need. So I think it's Matthew Arbsfield, or I'm probably horribly mispronouncing his name, did did a pull request kind of recently for, over there updating on, something that would support over there updating. where you could just load an arbitrary JavaScript file. So just the support that we've had from the community, and like they're using it for whatever they need it for, and editing it for whatever they need it for. So I've been really impressed with all of that.
So this is something that Facebook is using internally as well as something you guys have open sourced. How much extra effort has it been to maintain the open source part of this project, I guess, specifically with Android? I know we've spoken a lot about the project in general, but specifically with Android, how much like manpower, I guess, do you guys have kind of working on this?
For open source, it's actually like a pretty significant amount of time keeping the builds green and reviewing issues and pull requests. But it's something that we really want to do, because I think like one of the greatest strengths of this project, which I completely underestimated when we started talking about open source, is just the community around it and the excitement around it. I think it's something that we really need to preserve. So it's the things that I really like about it is that having so many eyes on it means that we get so many great ideas from the rest of the community. And that's part of the reason why React itself has been so successful. People are doing all these interesting things that, we wouldn't have thought of necessarily, or we maybe wouldn't think of for a really long time. Examples would be like the hot loading stuff who did the hot loading stuff? Dan Abramov, I think.
Yeah, Dan Abramov.
Yeah. The React hot loader, that's mind blowing. A lot of the stuff is pushing the industry to places it hasn't been before. And I'm really excited to see that happen with React Native as well, like it's been happening for React itself. But as far as the amount of time it takes for maintaining open source, we've right now got on the Android side, Martin Konachek, who's done a really great job with kind of being the face of React Native Android, who's that's pretty much all he does is reviewing pull requests, working on open sourcing new views. We open source kind of a minimal set of what we have internally to something that would allow people to start writing some apps. But there's been tons of requests for things like the art views that they have on iOS, various features that they have on iOS. The iOS project has just existed for a year and a half longer than the Android one. So that's just been a full-time job. And he's actually, I think, getting a new person too. So we'll have 2 people working on that.
That's cool. How long has the project been around for before it got open source? What was the lead time? Did you start working on it in January when it was announced, or before that?
No, so for the Android version, we started working on it in August of 2014. So a little bit over a year ago. And the iOS version, I don't remember exactly when that was. I think that was another year and a bit before that. It started as one of Facebook's, how we do these hackathons, which are basically, this overnight coding session where you work on something that isn't necessarily related to your job. I think either Jordan or Christopher had the idea of rendering native applications using React, and they just hacked up a prototype that night and then presented it. And then it got, I think it went in front of Zuck, and Zuck was like, yeah, we should invest in this. And so they started working on that full time. But they got that prototype, I think, first came into existence in early 2013.
I know you had talked about the 15-minute development, the compilation of the Java project. Is that one of the main problems that you guys were kind of seeing in the native space, or what other positive things are you guys kind of seeing out of React Native in general, internally?
So it's not just the compilation. So the compilation has gotten a lot better than 15 minutes. It's still not amazing. I think it's probably more around the 30 seconds to 60 seconds or something like that, depending on what you change. And there's actually been a lot of really interesting work that people have done internally with our build system to not actually have to rebuild the whole APK on Android, which is the application binary, and just ship deltas over the USB cable and stuff. But the primary benefits, I think, have just been first of all, the people that can work on these projects. So it's actually very hard to get Android and iOS engineers. And we've had since 2012, we've been trying to hire specifically Android and iOS engineers to work on our apps. And it's always been kind of a place where we can never get enough. And with React Native being able to bring in people like new hires who have only done web development and have them go and, for example, someone implemented like inline comments for the Groups app that has its feed written in React Native. And they wrote that without iOS or Android knowledge. And when they wrote it, they like wrote it on iOS and it just, worked on Android. Whereas I think we also have a version of Groups written in native Android from before, and that one just doesn't have inline comments. And when they added inline comments on iOS, that doesn't magically add itself to Android. So those two things are really important. They kind of have these compounding effects too. So it's like by having the whole team just focused on, like the individual engineers are focused on features, they can work kind of closer together. They're not as segregated by the platforms that they work on. That's, from my experience, kind of a problem that we've had on every team that I've worked on, where the iOS engineers and the Android engineers, because they're not reviewing each other's patches and they're not like, they don't discuss necessarily the technology that they're implementing things with, because they're implementing on top of two different stacks. They're not really as close as they could be. But when you have these teams that are just developing using a single language and technology stack, then there's a lot more sharing that happens. And I've just seen the teams work more closely together. So there's a lot there.
You mentioned sharing code. What percentage of code would you say is shared?
To my knowledge, we've only done that analysis on the Ads Manager app. We probably did on the Groups app. I don't know the number though. With Ads Manager, I think it was like 85% of the code was shared. And that's mainly because like with that kind of app where it's just kind of content views and stuff, and the content views don't really change depending on the platform. It's like the Ads Manager app, if you're not familiar with it, it's just like an app that lets you manage your Facebook ads. It has a list of the ads and campaigns that you're currently running, and then it will give you like a visual graph of like how they're performing and let you edit them and stuff. And a lot of those flows are the same on both platforms. It's just maybe in some places you show a dialogue that's styled for iOS, and in some places you show a dialogue that's styled for Android. Or maybe in some places you have like a scroll view that refreshes by, you like pull it down, and on iOS the scroll view like bounces and the refresh indicators kind of lives at the very top, whereas on Android it like kind of appears over top of the scroll view. So they're like all these little things that make the app feel native to that platform, but the core of the logic of the app is mostly the same. So I remember for Ads Manager it's like 85%. I would expect it's probably around the same for Groups, because that is maybe even more shared code there actually, because the general concept is the exact same for both of them.
Certainly. Yeah, I think I know from my company, moving to React and React Native, the whole idea is just to be able to reuse a lot of the code that does that binding behind the scenes with whatever it is, the network or just the logic in general, and then leave the specifics to the device to React. What is that? So you mentioned 85% for the AdWords, but what is that concept? Is that a big part of what you guys do at Facebook? And with React is as much reuse as possible? Is there emphasis on that, or is that just something that's not really focused on?
Yeah. So the catchphrase that I guess we've said a lot is this like learn once, write anywhere, as opposed to write once, run anywhere.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think in order to like the whole write once, run anywhere has like a pretty negative stigma, I think, in the community. And we've wanted to kind of err on the opposite side of like, I would say maybe we've overcorrected in the whole learn once, write anywhere thing, because there still are benefits to sharing this code, and we are able to share a lot of things. So I won't say that it's like not an emphasis, but I would say a higher priority is being able to build apps that feel native for the platform. And with React Native, we can luckily do that while still sharing a large amount of code.
So I guess we'll go into the actual development for like people that are going to be kind of using the project. I guess getting started with the Android build, if you're kind of been used to the iOS, say that you've already built like an app or something, and then you're kind of just jumping into the Android part. What like differences are there, like as far as the API and stuff goes?
So the JS APIs should generally be the same. I mean, they are the same for the most part, I guess. So the best place to look there is really the website that we have set up that kind of lists some of the differences between iOS and Android. Some of these things are like, differences that we're currently working on. They're differences that shouldn't exist and won't exist long term. So like an example is, I think right now for when you like measure a view, on Android, it's like measured relative to like the parent view, and on iOS is like relative to the screen or something like that. So there are some places where we're still working on getting rid of the differences between the platforms, but it should feel, very similar. Yeah.
So with React Native for Android, you have to set up the SDK and additional tooling. What are you guys doing to address that versus how easy it is to jump into React Native for iOS?
I don't think that we have any like immediate plans to work on that. Like we know it's painful, but like there's a lot of stuff that we're currently working on. So people are asking for us to open source a lot of our view types that we haven't yet open source, asking for feature parity with iOS. I imagine there's something we can do with like allowing people to download some sort of package that would include the IDE and Gradle and the SDK and maybe like Genymotion or something, but I don't know if there would be like licensing issues with that or anything. I'm not sure. Do you guys have ideas? We'd love to hear them.
Well, I don't necessarily have ideas. I do wonder if that is one of the areas that Dan Abramov is going to be focusing on since he's joined Facebook.
I would think that this would be Martin who would be focusing on this, actually.
Okay. And the only reason I bring that up is that he tweeted that he would be working on React Native tooling, much like the tooling that everyone is aware of. He built the Redux dev tools and things like that. So he's now, and actually he tweeted that he would be starting with Facebook yesterday. So I just wondered if his work would be in there or not.
Yeah, I think that's really exciting. So some of the things that I think he's more going to be working on is maybe stuff related to the hot loader. And this is like pure speculation on my part because I haven't actually talked to him about what he's interested in working on. But sure. Stuff with the hot loader, stuff with, saving state more persistently. So on the web, you have, like with React Router and stuff like that, you can address, parts of a website. We don't really have that so much for our React Native apps right now. Being able to reload and have it actually stick you on the place where you were before would be like a huge productivity win for people. So I would really love to see him work on that kind of stuff. I'd love to have like some of the hot loader work, like hot loading for JavaScript modules, but also hot loading for native modules. If you add a dependency, you don't have to like recompile the iOS or Android app and just have it kind of appear for you. So I think that's maybe more in line with the kind of stuff that he would be working on, but I'm not 100% sure.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. That's probably very hot on his radar. So no pun intended.
Okay. So getting into what we were just talking about, like what exactly do you have to have on your machine to develop in Android with React Native?
I think right now you need to have the SDK, probably the NDK. I'm not sure if the NDK is the native development kit. That's what you have to compile C++ code, which is how we interface with JSC, which is our JavaScript runtime. And Genymotion is the emulator of choice for most Android developers. And unless you're going to use an Android phone for all of your development, which I probably wouldn't recommend, and for the same reason you don't use an iOS physical phone for all of your iOS development, you need to have Genymotion. And if you want to edit Android, like the actual Java code that's associated with the project, like if you want to edit a native module or something, you would probably want to install IntelliJ. I'm not sure how much more of that is than for iOS, which requires installing Xcode Xcode, I guess, but then Xcode comes with the simulator. They kind of have it all as a nice bundled deal. Yeah.
So is IntelliJ like the IDE of choice, or what are the options there?
Yeah, it's pretty much IntelliJ is the IDE of choice. Google also supports an IDE called Android Studio, but it's actually built on top of IntelliJ anyway. So,
okay.
And this is for like native Java code. I don't recommend this for editing JavaScript. If you're only editing JavaScript, then you don't really need these IDEs.
So could you use something like Sublime Text or something like that, I guess, if you're just doing the JavaScript development for React Native?
Yeah, I use Sublime.
So something I'm curious about, we've got a project on at the moment with this client who originally came in looking for a hybrid app because they wanted it cross-platform. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of somewhere between an app and a game. And we were looking at the user interface that they want us to implement. And we thought it's probably going to be a much better fit for a React Native app. And this was going back a couple of months, I think sort of probably 5 months into Chris's give us 6 months timeline. And the counter was still live, and there were rumors that there was an event coming up that React Native for Android might be released at. Very quiet rumors. But basically, I was like, look, I think we should take a risk. The iOS platform was really solid from day one and got better really quickly. And they were kind of skeptical. You know, it's a new thing. It hasn't been tested. There's always issues with the early releases. And now that it's out, it's, I guess, kind of had the predictable response. I mean, everyone got really excited and then, started using it. And there's been sort of mixed feedback about performance and stability and things like that. But it's here and it works and it's improving really quickly. And it seems like the trajectory is kind of similar to the trajectory that iOS had in the early days once it was first open sourced. What I'm curious about is, knowing it inside out as you do, would you recommend to someone to actually start a sort of production app in Anger on Android, or would you say give it a few more months to mature before you take a big risk on it? Where is it at in specifically the open source version of it that you guys have published?
Yeah, so I would say that it depends on the app that you're working on and how much you're willing to dig into the framework to try to maybe fix things yourself. I'd say the biggest focus point for the team right now is on perf, and that's on startup perf, that's on UI performance. There's a lot of stuff that, for Android UI performance that you more get for free on iOS. And that's partly because Apple has targeted a single hardware platform, like a single GPU. They work very closely with the people who write the drivers. They have that single, I think it was Imagination does all of their GPUs. And so they write specific drivers that do special optimizations for the iPhone. Android was kind of written to target a large number of pieces of hardware, and it was also originally written to not even necessarily require a GPU, so it still supports software rendering, whereas iOS was written to always require hardware rendering. I would say that we're still trying to get Android UI performance to where it's great by default. I think right now people for our internal apps, we're able to get it great, but it also has required a bit of actually having people who know what they're doing, being able to look at systrace. I published article or guide on the React Native website that kind of that documents how to use systrace, which is this tool that's actually used for profiling JavaScript in Chrome to see what your app is doing at any point in time on the JavaScript thread and on the main thread. And being able to look at that and see where are my hiccups actually coming from. If that's not something that you want to be willing to do or learn, then maybe you should wait a few months, I guess. We're trying to make it better. We want it to be great by default, and I think we can make it great by default.
I've got a lot of faith in you guys. I'm not trying to ask you the hard questions. I guess to put a bit more context around that for anyone who's listening and thinking of starting a project, you say a few months. What kind of differences are we talking here for people listening? Is it are we at 80% of where you'd like it to be? Does it need a bit more work than that? Or what should people expect at the moment?
So I think we're probably about like 75% of the way, like 75% where I want us to be, but there's like a lot of low hanging fruit optimizations that we can be making. And like I said, the internal focus for the entire team is on performance right now. Like, as you might imagine, our internal Facebook apps have very high standards for performance. We like see if we add, 100 milliseconds to startup time for some feature, that, engagement with it drops off by like X%. And when it's, hundreds of millions of people using it, that's a significant amount. And since a lot of teams, internally are looking at React Native to build new versions of their products, one of the things that they're asking us is like, okay, we need to be able to make sure that we have the same performance, like the same startup time, et cetera, that we had before. So I think in that realm, like some of the community concerns and like our own internal, what we're working on, are very well aligned. So, yeah.
I think one of the really nice things about building on open source platforms that Facebook publishes is, that Facebook's using them in production and that they've actually been tested at that kind of scale. And, if we've got problems with them, then you've probably got problems with them, and you're really probably working on fixing those problems for your own reasons as well as community drivers. So, it's cool to hear that they line up. When you say...
Yeah. And I would also say the advice that I give other people within the company and outside the company when they ask this is we've got the Ads Manager app that is in the Play Store and it's on the App Store. If you want to see what a React Native app that was built for both platforms feels like, download that and, play around with it and see if it meets your needs. Like if you're building something like that, then definitely go for React Native.
So on that note then, have you guys got any magic running behind the scenes that it might be hard for someone without your experience to recreate just from what's been published? Or, is it a fairly vanilla implementation of React Native for Android?
There's definitely things that we've done that are, like a bit special. All of it is open source though. So you can kind of like look at what we've done. Some of the optimizations that we've done are around like the three main ones I would talk about are like event coalescing. So if you're doing like a bunch of scrolling and you're delivering scroll events to the JS thread faster than it can deal with them, then it will only send JS the latest one. Same with like touch move events, and we've kind of got a configurable system for that. That's helped a lot. Some of it has been just really looking into what exactly is going on the phone at any point in time. This is especially important for like animations and gestures, and making sure that you're giving yourself as much of the full frame as possible. So on Android, this means using Choreographer. On iOS, this is using something called Display Link, which basically tells you when a VSync for the screen has happened. So when it has just displayed a new frame and is ready to start drawing another frame. So I don't know if I'd consider that magic, but that's kind of some of the low-level optimizations that we've done. And then we've also done some work around taking layout-only views that aren't contributing to anything that's actually drawn on the screen and making sure that they don't actually contribute to the native hierarchy. Trying to think of if we're doing other magical stuff. There's some stuff actually around on Android when you set alpha on a view or on text, it'll have to do off-screen rendering of that text and then composite it back onto the screen, which is actually very expensive for the GPU. So that basically means it'll draw your screen without that view or that text, and then it'll move that screen off into like slow memory on the GPU, draw the thing that's supposed to be alpha, so have some sort of opacity, and then have to pull the screen that I'd drawn before back from slow memory back into main fast memory and composite this thing on it. And that's like a really easy way to drop frames, and that's something that we disabled by default, which Android does not disable by default. iOS had actually disabled that by default up until I think like iOS 8 or 9. So I guess maybe some of that stuff is a bit magical.
Yeah, that's actually a really good thing to know. Is there a sort of repository of tricks like this that you guys have learned? Or
for me, it's just been a lot of stuff that I've learned from working on Android at Facebook in general. There's a bunch of really great stuff that both Apple and Google puts out around how to write performant apps. I know I've like used a lot of the work that Romain Guy has done on Android. He's done a lot of performance case studies where it's like, we had this poor performance on this app and here's how we dug in and found out what it was. The main difference I would say between some of the stuff that he does, or like what I want to make better from seeing what Google is doing, is they put a lot of onus on the developers to go and figure a lot of this stuff out. Like, they've chosen to make the default not performant for something like alpha, and then people are getting bitten by it, and their response is to put out, a guide on how to debug it, as opposed to making it just work better by default, I think. And I'm not trying to attack Google, but they're just places that I think we can do better in our development, our development experience.
So when you say, be comfortable sort of hacking on the platform itself, you mean Android development in general, right? Not so much the JavaScript portions of React Native.
Well, I just mean so using Systrace kind of started as an Android tool. We actually, Tadeu wrote kind of a polyfill for it on iOS. This is a tool that might tell you that your performance issues are in native code, or they might tell you that they're actually in JavaScript and that you're doing something really expensive. So I more mean being willing to use those kind of tools, which I guess is maybe less expected of you as a web developer, maybe. I know as a web developer, in trying to make performant web apps, I also would look into that kind of stuff, but it just seems kind of less expected.
Yeah, and I think that's really good to know going in. I mean, we do have tools like that evolving in the web development environment, but I guess they're certainly more mature in the native platforms, and it's good to get your hands dirty a bit with the tools that native developers use.
Right. And I mean, if people are hitting those kinds of those issues where things aren't performant by default, we want to see GitHub issues so that we can fix it for everyone as well. Cool.
Something else I was curious about is how did you go about architecting the Android version of React Native? Was it, a fairly straightforward parallel to the work that had been done on iOS, or did you have to take a step back and really, come at it a bit differently in terms of solving the same problems for a different platform?
There are a lot of places where it is very similar. So is just having JavaScript run in one thread, having a UI thread that's separate, and having, basically multiple event loops were things that we did on both iOS and Android. And we both kind of came to the decision that those were good ideas separately. So when we were going and working on the Android part, we weren't married to doing everything the exact way that iOS had done it. We wanted to figure out whatever made sense for Android. And it kind of turned out that a lot of the decisions that they made on iOS also ended up making sense for Android. So you'll see very similar threading models, like I was saying, the multiple event loop structure, the same kind of serializable communication between JavaScript and native. Yeah, I think, Toddy, you talked about some of that stuff with the bridge, right, last week?
Yeah. Well, is there any other questions anyone wants to throw in there before we wrap this up? Or Andy, is there anything that you kind of think that we should talk about that we haven't really gone over?
I would really recommend watching some of the talks that we've given if you haven't already watched them. I know Martin has a really good one they did recently talking about some of the internals of React Native for Android, and also some of the work that's been involved in open sourcing it and what our open source workflow has been since we open sourced it. I think that's really interesting. He talks about a ton of different topics. I think that was given at, I forget what the conference, I think it was the Reactive conference in Prague or something like that, but I think it's on YouTube or on Martin's Twitter. I would just highly recommend checking that out.
Cool. Yeah, we'll definitely try to come up with a couple of those links and put them in our notes. One other thing, as far as the open source community is concerned, what are the most needed parts of people can kind of contribute to as of right now that you guys are kind of needing help on, I guess, from the community?
I think the things that we need the most help with are some of the parity issues between the platforms. I think those are the things that are kind of been the biggest pain to people. So if there are things that they're the biggest pain to the community. So if the community helps fix it, they're helping fix it for, everyone else in the community. We're also trying to work on some of these things, but like grab an issue that you see that's open related to this, and like we'll review the pull request. Like we love that kind of work. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing.
Okay, cool. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and jump to the picks. Jed, would you like to go first?
Yeah, my pick this week would have to be the Getting Started with Redux tutorial series that Dan Abramov just published to egghead.io. If you haven't had a chance to learn Redux yet, or even if you have, it probably takes about 2 hours to go through all 30 videos, and they're fantastic. It's a great framework and a great learning resource. So that would be my pick.
Kevin?
My pick's going to be also related to Redux, but James Long had a post this past week called "A Simple Way to Route with Redux," and essentially he bypasses a lot of what the other routers have and things that are on top of React Router have done, and he has a Redux simple router that offloads all the work to React Router. Sorry that it's hard to keep them all in sync when they have the same name. But it's an interesting post. I'm not necessarily sure if I'll use it, but it's interesting read. And the other post I have is not really tech related, but it's called The Secret Power of Read It Later apps. And it's an interesting read about how we Instapaper and Pocket everything, but we hardly ever go back and read them, and just dealing with the information overload we have today. So that's it.
Okay, my picks are going to be the first one is the material design components that were put out for React Native. The repo is by Ben Zhao, but it's really cool. So it allows you to kind of implement some of the material design stuff into React Native with some preset styling. The second pick is the book 7 Languages in 7 Weeks. I'm about, I guess, 20% into it so far, so I'm not done with it, but it's actually really cool, and I'm enjoying it, and it kind of opens your mind up to a lot of other stuff that can be done with other languages that you're not really aware of, I guess. And my last pick is actually Legoland and the Legoland Hotel. I'm going to be going there with my family, and I haven't been there, but from everything I see, the rooms look really cool. If you have kids, they have like Lego-themed rooms and stuff, so I would recommend checking that out. There's one in California, and there's one in Florida, and I believe there's a few in Europe. So that's about it. Andy?
I guess I'd probably have 2 picks, so they're kind of higher level than I think the ones you had. But so the first one would be Radiolab, which is probably one of my favorite podcasts. And they just talk about interesting developments in science, and then like really get into what the implications might be. So an example is recently they kind of talked about how some local governments are now hiring companies to kind of fly drones over the city and take a photo every second. And then when there's like a crime or something, they can locate the crime and then kind of play time backwards and see where did the person come from, where did they end up going afterwards. They've also done stuff. They had a whole episode about taking this one poem that was written in French and having like 100 different people translate it into English. And all of the poems that resulted were all like different and tried to capture different pieces of the poem as it existed in French. So it's a really great podcast. And then probably second is one of my favorite books is Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. There's no way I'm going to say his last name right. But it's a book that kind of talks about about the flow state that you can kind of get into. And I bet as programmers, a lot of you have felt that, where it's like you just kind of get in the zone and you're creating something and the world kind of doesn't exist outside of that. And it's like, what does it mean to be in that state, and how do you get into that state more often, and stuff like that. So
awesome. Yeah, I just subscribed to Radiolab after hearing that. That looks really cool. I'm looking forward to listening to those.
cool.
All right. Well, Andy, I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time out of your day to join us. It's been really, really interesting.
No problem. That was great talking to you all.
All right. Well, that wraps up episode 10 of React Native Radio. We'll talk to you guys next week.